Hello, how are you? I'm fine, thank you. Sit down, please. I would like to speak English today too, to improve my speaking skill. Let's get it started. You should study every day, or twice, twice, 3 times a week. You should make your time to study in a week, at least 3 times a week. You ought to make your time to study. You always say you don't have time. But time is to made. You have to make your time to study yourself. You should study every day. You should study 5 days in a week, except for Sundays and Saturdays. Or you should study 6 days in a week, except for Sunday. You ought to study 6 days a week per week. You ought not to eat much at lunchtime, otherwise you will feel sleepy. But some people even feel sleepy when they eat little, although they don't eat much. You had better not eat much at lunchtime. You had better not eat lunch much, a lot. I ought to study now, but I cannot concentrate on my study because the noise coming from the neighbor. Someone must be playing the guitar. The government should take drastic measure to change the country. The city mayor should take action to change this city. The city mayor ought to take drastic measure to improve the finance in the city. You ought not to say such a thing to him. You ought not to eat lunch while taking the class. You ought not to use your smartphone during the class. You ought not to use your smartphone at the theater. You ought not to drink or eat in the train. You ought not to say such a thing to me. You ought not to eat much. You ought not to drink much. You ought not to spend much money on such a thing. You ought not to spend money on gambling. You ought not to study late at night the day before your examination. You ought not to stay late the day before your examination. Otherwise, your brain won't work. So that your brain will work, you have to have enough sleep. Six hours at least. Please have 6 hours of sleep the day before your examination, so that your brain will work enough. You ought not to drink much of alcohol. You ought not to enter dangerous zone. You ought not to spend much of your money on such a thing. You ought not to exaggerate your skill, though you don't have such skill. You ought not to waste your time and money. You ought not to waste your time playing the video game. You ought not to waste your precious time playing video game, watching a movie. You ought not to waste your money on video games. You ought not to sleep a lot, like 12 hours. You ought not to speak aloud in the library. You ought not to speak aloud in public places. You ought not to walk in rows, on the street, on the road. You ought not to speed much. You ought not to speed much beyond the limitation. You ought not to speed beyond the speed limitation. You ought not swim beyond the limitation. You ought not to look down on others. You ought not to sleep just after eating dinner. You ought not to sleep just after eating dinner. You should be studying now. You should study now. You should go to bed. It's time you went to bed. You should exercise regularly to keep shape, to keep healthy, okay? Okay. I should have taken the earlier bus because I was late for the class. I should have got up 5 minutes earlier, and I could catch the train. I could catch the train. I should have challenged the audition because I cannot take the audition anymore. If I had challenged the audition, I might have won the audition. If I had challenged the audition, I could have won the audition. I should have proposed to her because she has already a husband. I should have proposed to her earlier before she was stolen by another guy. I should have got the full shot before I was infected with flu. Now I am done with the fever of 41 degrees Celsius. I should have left my house 30 minutes earlier because I got into a traffic jam on the way this morning. In order to avoid traffic congestion, you had better leave your house 30 minutes earlier than usual time, okay? Okie dokie. I should not have bought such expensive bag for myself. just because of the brand name. I should not have bought the bag just for the brand name. And it was just expensive. The feature is nothing special. The feature is almost same as other cheaper bags. I should not have spent much my money on such a thing. Gambling, video games, DVD and so on. I shouldn't have said such a thing to her. She is angry now. I shouldn't have taken the course because it is too difficult for me to understand. It is super hard to keep up with the class and level. I'm always asking my friends about what I don't know. I shouldn't have eaten much lunch because I feel sleepy now. You shouldn't have eaten so much at the lunchtime. That's why you are feeling sleepy now. But coffee might help you, so I can get you a cup of coffee. Would you like a cup of coffee? I can go to buy it. Okay, thank you. I ought to have bought the ticket to the concert, but because it is sold out now. I ought to have bought the ticket when I found it, because it is already sold out. I cannot go to the concert with my girlfriend already. But I might be able to buy the ticket from another site. I ought to have challenged the audition. I ought to have challenged more things when I was younger. One thing elderly people regret is that they didn't challenge. So I would like to challenge before I get old. One thing that the elderly people regret is that they didn't challenge. So I would like to challenge more things before I get older, before I become an elderly person. I ought to have taken Route 6, but due to my mistake, my wrong thinking, I took the another different route. Now I'm going to the reverse. I have to turn back. I have to turn my car around and change the direction. I ought to have brought umbrella. I ought to have brought umbrella. I ought to have brought umbrella because it's raining. I have to buy a new one at the convenience store, which is waste of money. I cannot count how many umbrellas I bought, thanks to my forget. I ought to have brought my laptop PC because everything is everything is included in the PC. I ought to have brought my SD card to the company because everything is included in the SD card. I ought to have proposed to my favorite girl. I ought to have proposed to my favorite guy. I ought to have dropped by at the convenience store on my way home. Now I'm very lazy. I don't want to go buy the food. I ought to have bought a tissue paper because my house is out of tissue paper. So we have to use toilet paper instead. I ought to have bought food on my way home. I ought to have bought some food and drinks on my way home. I do not know. I'm out of food and drinks in my fridge. I noticed it when I opened my fridge. I ought to have bought something special for my daughter because it is her birthday today. You ought not to have said such a thing to her. You ought not to have eaten in the train. That's why you are fined for that. You are fined 10,000 yen for eating and drinks in the train. You ought not to have eaten and drinks in the train. You ought not to have spoken aloud in the library. You ought not to have traveled to foreign countries then. It was an emergency in the company. You ought not to have taken a trip to foreign countries then. You ought not to have gone outside because coronavirus was outside. You ought not to have gone to the airport because coronavirus was in the airport. You ought not to have taken the wrong train. That's why you are late for the work. You ought not to have taken the wrong bus. You ought not to have eaten durian before your party because you are smelly. You ought not to have eaten durian because it's very smelly. You ought not to have had durian before your meeting. You ought not to have said such a thing to me. You ought not to have taken the wrong bus. You ought not to have submitted the report to him. You ought not to have visited your friends on short notice. You ought not to have eaten so much at the lunch. You ought not to have taken the wrong train. You ought not to have eaten so much before your examination. You ought not to have studied so much late at night the day before your examination. You ought not to say such a thing to other people. You ought not to speak aloud in the public areas. You ought not to speak aloud in the library. You ought not to say terrible things to other people. You ought not to have eaten much before you slept. You ought not to have said such a thing to him. You ought not to have said such a thing to him. You ought not to have said such a thing to him. You ought not to have said such a thing to him. You ought not to have said such a thing to me. You ought not to have taken the wrong address, a wrong bus. You ought not to have submitted your resume, not completed resume to the company. That's why you were rejected immediately. You ought not to have submitted your uncompleted resume to the company. You ought not to have told a lie to your friend. You ought not to have told a lie to your parents. You ought not to have told a lie to your parents. You ought not to have told a lie to your friends. You ought not to have told a lie to your friends. You shouldn't have told a lie to your friends. You should not have told such a thing to him. You shouldn't have told a lie to him. You shouldn't take the lesson today. You shouldn't have taken the course today. You shouldn't have ordered the menu today. You ought not to have ordered the menu today. You ought not to have bought the mirror. You ought not to have bought such expensive tissue paper. You ought not to have spent much money on gambling. You ought not to have spent much money on video games. You ought not to have spent much money on cosmetics. You ought not to have spent much money on coffee. You ought not to have spent much money on books. You ought not to have wasted your time wandering around the park. You ought not to have thrown away your old books. They might have been sold higher price. The books might be sold at high prices. You ought not to have sold the books at the bookstore. If you had sold the books online, the price must have been much higher. If you had sold the books online through SNS, the price must have been much higher than at the bookstore. You ought not to have sold the books at the bookstore. You ought not to have sold your guitar at the second-hand shop. If you had sold your guitar online, you could have sold it much higher, at higher price. If you had sold your guitar online, you could have got higher price. You could have got more money. Because if you sell things online, no shops interfere on your trade between people and people, between person and person. You ought not to have bought the guitar at the second-hand shop. You ought not to have bought the computer at the company, because I knew the company that you can buy the same computer at much cheaper price. So if you have any questions about computer, please let me know next time, please, so that you won't lose your money, so that you can save money. You ought not to have stayed late at night one day before your examination. You ought not to have stolen money from the bank. That's why you were arrested. You ought not to have bought such a cheap pencil for your very important examinations. You ought to have got up 5 minutes earlier. You ought to have studied harder when you were a junior high school student. You ought to have spent more time studying when you were a high school student. You ought to have studied harder. You ought to have practiced harder. You ought to have practiced harder. You ought to have studied harder. You ought to have studied harder. You ought to have studied harder. You ought not to have eaten so much. You ought to have studied harder. You ought to have practiced harder. You ought to have left your house 30 minutes earlier. You ought to have arrived at the company at 10 minutes earlier at least. You ought to have arrived at the school 10 minutes earlier at least. You ought to have arrived at the airport 2 hours before the departure time. You ought to arrive at the airport at least 2 hours before the departure time, okay? If it is international flight. You ought to arrive at the airport 2 hours before the departure at least. You ought to have arrived at the station 1 hour before the departure, because this is your first time to take Shinkansen. So in case of losing your way, you ought to have arrived at the station 1 hour before the departure time. And you also wanted to buy lunchbox which you eat in the Shinkansen. So you ought to have arrived at the station 1 hour before the departure time. You ought not to have eaten in the train, in the local train. You ought not to have listened to music with big volume, because the volume was bothering other passengers. You ought not you ought not to have listened to music with big volume at night, because neighboring was sleeping. You ought not to have eaten food during the class, because that's why teacher got angry. You ought not to have eaten food during the meeting, because the smell was spreading around the room. Everyone noticed it, but no one could confront with you, because you are a boss. Tick, tick, tick. You ought not to say such a thing to me. You ought not to say such a thing to her. You ought not to say such a thing to him. You ought not to eat or drinks in the train. You ought not to take the wrong train. You ought not to stay late at night the day before your examination. You ought not to stay late the day before your examination. You ought not to say such a thing to me. You ought not to have said such a thing to me. You ought not to have taken the wrong flight. You ought not to have said such a thing to her. You ought not to have taken the wrong train. You ought not to have been late for your school on such an important day. You ought not to have been late for your workplace. You ought not to have eaten much food at lunch. You ought not to have eaten much. You ought not to have eaten much before your examination, because you were sleepy during the examination. You were feeling sleepy during your examination. You ought not to have eaten much. You ought not to have eaten much. You ought not to have said such a thing to him. You ought not to have eaten much. You ought not to have eaten much. You ought not to have studied late at night yesterday. You ought not to have eaten ramen at lunchtime today. You ought not to have eaten curry rice when you are wearing a white t-shirt. That's why your white t-shirt was contaminated, polluted by curry. The snow should be finished by next week. The snow should melt by tomorrow. I guess so. I predict so. I think so. I bet so. The rain will stop raining. The rain will stop. The rain should stop by tomorrow. The rain should stop in 2 hours. My daughter should arrive at school soon. My daughter ought to arrive at school soon. My genius friend should pass the examination easily. My genius friend should solve the problem smoothly. Some dignitaries should know the result of the examination earlier than us, earlier than citizens. Some dignitaries should know the name of New Era, which was earlier than me, earlier than us. Some people should have already known the name of New Era before it was released to us, before it was announced to us. You should have 3 days off in a row, someday this year. She should come here in an hour. She should be coming now. She should be on her way home. My father should be on his way to workplace. She should be here in an hour. She ought to be here in an hour. She ought to be here in an hour. She ought to be here in an hour. Snow ought to melt in an hour. Snow ought to melt tomorrow. Snow ought to melt during the day when the sun comes out. Snow ought to melt during the day when the sun comes out. My mother ought to wash the dishes for our guest. My mother should wash the dishes for our guest. He ought to take the place of the person who will be absent in the future. He ought to take the place of her. The company ought to have responsibility for the accident. The driver ought to have the responsibility for the accident. The driver ought to hold the responsibility for the accident. The amusement park ought to open next year, if my memory is correct. The bus ought to leave here at 5:30. The bus ought to leave here at 5:30. The bus ought to come here in an hour. The bus ought to come here in 15 minutes. The bus going to Tokyo Station ought to stop here. The bus going to Ueno Station should stop here. The bus going to Narita Airport ought to stop here. Ought to stop this bus stop too. The bus going to Haneda Airport ought to stop here too. My friend ought to stay at the same hotel too. My friend ought to come here too. She ought to join the party too. She ought to join the party too. She should have left the house at 5:30 today, this morning. So she should be at her workplace now. She should have taken the course, taken the class. She should have finished the textbook. She should have taken the textbook. She should have finished the textbook. She should have graduated from the University of Kyoto. She should have majored in biology. She should have majored in geology. She should have left the workplace before 7 o'clock p.m. yesterday. She should have bought the umbrella at the same convenience store yesterday. She should have been having dinner with me yesterday at that time. So, I don't know why. We should have taken the rules. We should have obeyed the rules as it was directed on the paper, on the directions. We should have done as it was directed in the directions. I should have done as it was directed on the manual. I ought to have done as it was directed on the manual. So, what is wrong? I should have sent my money to my mother. Could you check it, please? I should have ordered the mouse pad 3 days ago. I should have ordered the mouse pad and computer screen 3 days ago. Could you confirm that, please? I ought to have ordered the mouse pad, and keyboard and screen. Could you check that, please? Okay, yes, I have the record here. We are preparing for the shipping now. Thank you for letting me know. We will soon ship them. Thank you for your patronage, and I hope you will shop with us next time. Thank you. Thank you. Gracias. Grazie. Merci. Tak. シェイシェイ、カムサハムニダ。ありがとうございます。The train ought to have left 2 minutes ago. The train ought to have left 2 minutes ago. The train ought to have left 5 minutes ago. She ought to have graduated from the University of Kyoto. She ought to have graduated from the University of Tokyo. My grandmother ought to have taken the correct train heading for Tokyo Station. My grandparents ought to have the correct Shinkansen heading for Nagoya. Tomorrow ought to be sunny. If the weather forecast is correct, tomorrow ought to be sunny. If the weather forecast is correct, tomorrow ought to be cloudy. Tomorrow ought to be cloudy. ought to be cloudy, snowy, icy, mexy. The soccer team ought to beat the enemy. Team 2, Team B. The Team A ought to beat Team B. He ought to win the championship easily, because his level is far better than others. The plane ought to take off in an hour. The cleaning ought to be finished in an hour. The cleaning in the plane ought to be finished in 5 minutes, as far as I know. The cleaning in the hotel in the morning ought to be finished in an hour. The menu you ordered ought to arrive within 15 minutes, because this restaurant is known for the fast service and tasty at the same time. The menu you have ordered ought to arrive soon. Your effort ought to bear fruit. Your effort ought to bear fruit. Your effort ought to bear fruit in the near future. Your effort ought to bear fruit. 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 I ought to have ordered 5 grams of pizza. I ought to have ordered 5 grams of hamburger. I ought to have ordered fried chicken, fried potatoes, and hamburger combo. I ought to have ordered salad combo. I ought to have ordered T-bone steak 15 minutes ago. Could you check my menu, please? Could you check my order, please, again? I should have ordered 500 grams of hamburger. Could you check my order, please? Excuse me, I should have ordered 500 grams of hamburger. Could you check my order, please? I should have ordered 3 glasses of water. I should have ordered tonkatsu teishoku. I ought to have ordered menu set A. I ought to have brought umbrella, small umbrella in my bag. I ought to have put the SD card on your desk yesterday. I ought to have put the SD card on your desk yesterday. I ought to have closed all the doors and windows before I left the company. I ought to have closed all doors and windows before I left the company. I ought to have switched off all the lights yesterday. I ought to have turned off all conditioners yesterday. I should have closed the door, all the doors, closed all the doors and windows. I should have closed all doors and windows. I should have closed all doors and windows. I should have closed all doors, I should have closed all doors and windows before I left the company. I should have closed all doors. 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 I should have closed the windows. I should have closed all doors. I should have closed all doors and windows before I left the company. Please believe me. Someone must have broken into and opened the door. Please believe me. I cannot believe you, because you always told lies and make us laugh. I ought to have finished my homework yesterday. I ought to have ordered SD card, micro SD card. I ought to have sent the letter to her. I ought to have sent my letter to her 1 month ago. Why haven't you get it? Why haven't you get it yet? I should have ordered the menu. I ought to have ordered the menu. I should have closed all the doors and windows before I left the company. I ought to have closed the doors and windows. I ought to have closed all the doors and windows before I left the company. I ought to have done as it was directed in the manual, but I cannot move to the next step. I cannot. I should have done as it was directed on the manual, but I cannot print my computer screen. I cannot copy the important file. I ought to have conducted as it was directed in the manual, but I cannot print out the file yet. I cannot print out my file yet. Could you help me? I'm very bad at computer or machine, so please come here and help me. Thank you. No, I don't want to help you because you don't help me. Oh my god. I should have done as it was directed on the manual. I ought to have done as it was directed on the manual. Excuse me, I should have ordered T-bone steak. Could you check my order, please? Excuse me, I ought to have ordered 200 grams of salad. I'm sorry. We actually took your orders, but we are very busy preparing for other customers' menu. So please be patient. We will soon prepare for your menu. Thank you. I must study. I must speak. I must speak more. So to improve my speaking, I have to speak more. To improve my speaking skill, so that I can be as fluent as foreign people. I have to study. I must study. I must speak more. I must study more frequently in order to get used to speaking. I have to study more frequently so as to be used to speaking. I have to speak more frequently so as to be used to speaking. I have to speak English more frequently in order to get used to it. I have got to speak, I have got to speak, I have got to go, 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 I have got to go. We got the power, we got the power. I have got to speak more frequently. I have got to speak, I have got to speak more frequently. I have got to speak more frequently. To get used to speaking. To be used to speaking. I have got to study, I have got to speak. I have got to speak more frequently. I have got to speak more frequently. Have got, have got, have got. I have a pen. I have got a pen. Have you got a pen? Have you got a passport? I have a passport. I have got a passport. I have a passport. I have got a passport. I have to prepare for my examination. I have got to prepare for my examination. I have to cook dinner. I have got to cook dinner. I have to study English. I have got to study English. You have to study English. She has to wash dishes. She has got to wash dishes. You had better obey the rules. You had better obey the rules. You had better obey the rules. You had better not say such a thing to me. You had better not waste your money on gambling. You had better not say. You had better not be with him. You had better not speak aloud in the library. You had better not go to the school. You had better not eat much. You had better not stay late at night the day before your examination. You had better not speak aloud in the library. You had better not eat much before your examination. You had better not eat much at lunchtime, so that you won't feel sleepy. In order that you will not feel sleepy. That must be truth. That must be a lie. That must be a fraud. That must be a fraud. The email must be a fraud. Phishing scam. The email must be a phishing scam. That email must be a remittance soliciting fraud. Remittance soliciting fraud. Remittance soliciting fraud. Phishing scam. That must be a phishing scam. That must be a remittance soliciting fraud. Remittance soliciting fraud. So be careful. You must be joking. You have to be joking. You have to be making a funny story. You have to be making a funny story. You have to be making fun of me. You have to be making a funny story. Just now. You have to be making a funny story now. You have to be joking. You have to be making a funny story now. You have to be hiding something important now. You have to hide something important. You have to hide something important. You have to hide something secret, something very important. The thing shining in the sky must be a star. The thing shining in the sky have to be a plane. The thing, the object shining in the sky have to be a plane. The object shining in the sky have to be a star. The objects shining in the sky must be stars. The objects shining in the sky have to be stars. The objects shining in the sky have to be stars. The objects shining in the sky have to be stars. The objects shining in the sky have to be stars. The objects shining in the sky have to be stars. Stars. This voice have to be my friend. This voice have to be my father. This voice have to be my friend. This voice have to be my daughter. This voice must be my daughter. This sound have to be my father's car. This sound must come from neighbor. She must pass the entrance examination easily. She has to pass the entrance examination easily. Her resume must be accepted at company easily. Her resume has to be accepted at the company because her resume and background is perfect. Every company wants her. No other company will reject her resume. Her resume is very attractive. She must win the race. She has to win the race easily. With more bad economy and lower revenue, the government has to raise consumption tax. The government must raise our consumption tax. With lower revenue, the government has to raise our consumption tax. The government must raise our consumption tax from 10 to 15, maybe. I don't know. The object shining in the sky must be a star. Has to be a star. The objects shining in the sky have to be stars. Must be stars. You must be joking. You have to be joking. You have to be taking a class now. You have to be commuting now. You have to be commuting now because I can hear the noise coming from outside. You have to be walking outside now. I'm sure you are not inside your room because I can hear the noise coming from outside. You must be walking outside now. Actually, next to Yodobashi camera, I can listen to the music from Yodobashi camera. You must be walking next to Yodobashi camera in Umeda, near Umeda. You have to be walking near Yodobashi camera at Umeda. Am I right or am I wrong? The answer must have been A. The correct answer must have been changed by the author, by the host. The date must have been changed by the host. The policy must have been changed by the government. The rule and law must have been changed by the government, by the lawyer within 2 years. The past 2 years. Someone must have broken into my house because my room is very, very messy and many things are broken. My friend must have already left for Japan. She is offline on Facebook. I cannot message. When I messaged her, she didn't reply, and she has been offline since 3 hours ago. So she must have already taken off from London. She must have taken off from London towards for Japan. When I sent a message to her, she was already offline because she must have left for Japan. Her plane must have taken off towards Japan already. She must have been left. She must have slept over. She must have been sleeping now. She must have left for the school. She must have been late for the school. She must have been late for the school yesterday. She must have been late for school this morning because she missed the train. She missed the train. She must have been late for school. 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 The answer must have been A. Sports meet open must have been called off by the president, the mayor, the principal. The flight must have been delayed due to inclement weather. The flight must have been cancelled due to typhoon. My friend must have cancelled her flight to Japan due to typhoon. My friend must have changed her trip from USA to Canada. My friend dropped out of his school. He shouldn't have been sleeping at the class every day. His new year at the same grade started. He shouldn't have been sleeping every day at the class. So he failed all the examination. So he has to take the same year again. I have nothing to do with the virus. I have nothing to do with the accident. The doctor has nothing to do with the operation. The hospital has nothing to do with the accident. I have something to do with the examination. I have little to do with the story. She has little to do with the story. She has little to do with the accident. She has little to do with the accident. She has little to do with the accident. She has nothing to do with the accident. She has something to do with the accident. The politician has something to do with the bribe. The politician has nothing to do with the bribe. The politician has little to do with the bribe. The politician must have had something to do with the bribe. The politician must have had something to do with the bribe. The politician must have had something to do with the bribe. The doctor must have had nothing to do with the bribe. The doctor must have had little to do with the bribe. The doctor must have had something to do with the bribe. The politician must have had something to do with the bribe. You mustn't stay late the day before your examination. You mustn't violate law. You must not violate laws. You must not intrude into water territories of foreign countries without permission. You must not stay late at night the day before your examination. You must not eat much before your class or work, otherwise you will feel sleepy. Your efficiency of your work will low. Your efficiency of work will decrease, will be low, will be lower. You don't have to apologize to me. I'm okay. I don't care about it. You don't have to apologize to me. The politician must have had something to do with the bribe. The hooligans must have launched rockets, fireworks on the river. The hooligans must have launched fireworks on the river, where it is prohibited to launch fireworks. The hooligans must have launched fireworks along the river yesterday, where it is prohibited to launch fireworks. Okay, I will finish talking here. Thank you for watching. See you next time. See you!